Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. John White, former Chancellor of the University of Arkansas. Under John's leadership, Arkansas grew to become the nationally competitive, student-centered research university that Arkansas needed and deserved for the 21st century. He also improved dramatically almost every metric. David Gerhardt, the fifth Chancellor of the university, said of John, "Perhaps no one in the university's history oversaw more qualitative and quantitative changes than Chancellor White, changes that are deep, dramatic, and certain to endure." John joins us today to talk about higher ed governance, a topic with which he is very familiar, having sat on multiple corporate and higher ed boards, and how higher ed governance is changing and why it must change to ensure higher ed remains relevant. John, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much, Drumm. It's great to be with you.
Likewise. And, we've been having some great conversation about higher ed board governance and what's changing, things along those lines. But before we get into the meat of the discussion, tell us a little bit about your background, because that is going to really help frame our conversation.
I'm the son of educators. My mom and dad together had combined 70 years of service to the public school systems of Arkansas. And I married a teacher. My sister's a teacher. Teaching was all in my family. And then when I graduated from the University of Arkansas, I went to work. I was in engineering and I was in industry. Along the way, I learned, I'm sure you've heard the poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And those great lines, "I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." Well, I'm afraid that I didn't really adhere to Robert Frost's advice. I, in fact, followed the advice of that great philosopher, Yogi Berra. If you come to a fork in the road, take it. Basically, it was the tyranny of the or. Business or academe. I said, no, it's not either or, it's going to be both. And so I tried to structure my career by traveling in both of those domains, in academe and in business. And I did that really against recommendation of a lot of people within the academy. Mm-hmm. But I managed to succeed at it. I mean, when I was on the corporate boards I was on, it was like getting an MBA or something. I just learned so much that I could take and apply in the academic setting, and likewise in government when I was leading the engineering director at the National Science Foundation, that I used a lot of the things that I learned from business, but also from leading nonprofit organizations, particularly the professional societies. Peter Drucker, management guru, he was one of the first to talk about knowledge workers. Well, that's like trying to lead leaders. The faculty are so independent, but likewise, when you get into a professional organization, the way that you accomplish things is you do it by influence. It's not because of positional control or anything like that. So I've basically tried to maintain balance between keeping one foot in the academic arena and the other over in the business arena. And that seems to have worked for me.
Mm-hmm. Your background reminds me a little bit of one of my previous guests, Ami Moyal, who is the president of an Israeli university which focuses on engineering. And what he did was he brought those skills that he learned in leading high-tech engineering firms to university, execution, putting the plan together, continuous improvement, things like mm-hmm. that. But with your background in corporate governance, that really is a great primer for lack of a better word, is how higher ed governance is changing. I mean, publics, privates, it's all changing, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. And I'm not necessarily sure it's for the better, Drumm. I'm very concerned about where it's going. It's beginning to be too politicized.
Mm-hmm.
Politics has always been intense within the academy. In fact, Kissinger is credited with saying that politics in higher education are so intense because the stakes are so low. But actually, when I was with him, I asked if he had ever said that, and he didn't remember ever saying it. So I don't know who made it up, but it's certainly the case that politics within the academy are intense, but it's a different kind of politics. Now we're finding that a number of politicians are coming in and leading higher education institutions. We'll see how it plays out, but the situation in Florida is an interesting one because the faculty have come out and they're really expressed reservations about the senator from Nebraska being the president of the University of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Yet there have been places like David Bourne did a terrific job, I thought, at the University of Oklahoma. But then on the other hand, you run into the situation like happened at South Carolina, where it was the former of the military academy comes in to do, and there was a lack of fit, that the culture within a university is so different from the cultures in military organizations, within industry and all. So I'm concerned about how it's going to go. Sonny Perdue is now the chancellor of the University of Georgia system. We'll see how it works out, but it just looks to me like there's a tendency to lean more and more toward politicians, and you will find that particularly within publicly supported universities that governors will appoint. And so now I'm concerned about what governance is going to be. But interestingly, when I decided that I would write a book about leadership, the first thing I focused on was about governance and governing boards because of the contrast I saw between corporate boards and then those within higher education.
Mm-hmm.
I think the missing element is maybe the SEC. Within corporations, they clearly have a group that does it. But in universities, we're just so diverse.
Yeah. Well, there really isn't any other than accreditation and the Department of Education, which only really jumps in when there's an issue. There really isn't any oversight on how university boards are run, is there?
No, there isn't. And I think the accreditation bodies they're almost irrelevant today because of what's happened here with politics, that there's so many universities that would just say, well, so what? But at Arkansas, when Governor Faubus blocked Central High School over segregation issues, another thing he did was he required faculty at the public universities, colleges to sign a loyalty oath. Well, at the University of Arkansas, the top faculty just left. AUP censored the University of Arkansas, and that set the university back at least 20 years because of that. Now, AUP has censored the University of Georgia system. Well, I don't know that that's going to have any impact whatsoever.
No, not really. And even though AAUP has now aligned itself with the NEA, the National Education Association, I don't know what's going to happen with that.
Yeah.
But outside of, the public interference that we certainly have right now, there's I see a lack of independence and especially undue influence, both with public universities, but even with private universities as well. I mean, when you get a wealthy individual on your board and he or she is making a significant contribution, there tends to be a lack of a better word or a deference to that person. And they may be doing something that they think is the best for the university, but it may not be. But because they're given so much money, they say, oh, well, yeah, this is a great idea because we don't want to lose your donation.
Exactly. And certainly within the public side, it's that these individuals will have so much influence with either the governor or the legislators that they have way too much influence and control, I think. it becomes more public when it relates to athletics. But don't be misled. It's not just limited to athletics. It's just that the other areas don't get the kind of press coverage. It's a big concern, frankly, and it's not just something that's hypothetical. It's actually occurring. It's ongoing. It's alive and well within public education across this country. It's a concern for me.
Mm-hmm. And to me, it just dropped. It all boils down to what are we doing to help the students? And we've got such a division in this country between, the ultra conservative versus the woke generation.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter where your politics are. You're going to fall on one side or the other. And faculty by politicians are just lumped into, the woke behaviors. To me, it's like, how do trustees, regardless of how you're appointed, how do they fulfill their fiduciary duties? I mean, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. I mean, these are, governance 101 in corporate America. But when you've got undue influence, when you've got conflicts of interest, how do you, as a trustee, fulfill your fiduciary duties? Their individual and their board duties.
Yeah. A person had a great influence on me was Frank Rhodes when he was the president at Cornell. And I was at the National Science Foundation leading the engineering director at the time when he was chair of the National Science Board. And he told the board members, he said, remember, our responsibility is to have noses in but fingers out. And that really stuck with me. In fact, I was talking with the former regent or trustee at Texas A&M University, and he told me that when Governor Bush, this is Bush 2, was appointing, that he would meet with prospects and ask them, do you understand the difference between oversight and management? Then he'd say, okay, tell me what it is. And he said, okay, look, you are responsible for oversight, but you're not there to manage the universities. You will hire the person to do that. So he understood the difference in noses in and fingers out. But now you look and trustees seem to want to run the university. Well, now that's a group grope, I can tell you, because you get a group of trustees and they all aren't going to see it the same way. It's just chaos. And now put the poor CEO for that university, the president or chancellor, is going to be caught right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not a good situation. I am not a pro Securities and Exchange Commission advocate, but I may tell you that for corporations, it serves a very necessary function, and it helps with the governance of that, because you know that if you step out of line on that, you can be legally liable. And you don't see that happening, not only within universities, but also nonprofit organizations. The not-for-profit organizations are facing a lot of the same challenges that we are in higher education with respect to governance. So I just wish that we had something that could hold people's feet to the fire and make sure that they are doing things with integrity. The big thing about the fiduciary responsibilities is, in the end, who are you supposed to be looking out for and whose interests? There are so many stakeholders, but I believe you have to start with the students. It starts with students first, and then you go on beyond that. But I know that when I was chancellor at the University of Arkansas, I think there must have been 1 million people who thought they could run the university better than I could. Man, there probably were some who could, but I was the one given a responsibility. But Lee Scott, at that time, was the CEO at Walmart. He had me addressing a group of their potential executives within the company, and in introducing me, he said, I thought I had a tough job until I watched what's happening with John White. He said, everyone who in the state who's been to a Razorback football or basketball game seems to think they know better how to run the university. And I thought, Lee, you don't realize just how right you are. But he said, so when I think I have a tough day, I just think about John White. Well, I appreciated that very much, but it didn't help me sort of deal with the issues I was dealing with.
Yeah. Well, one thing I tell presidents and boards is a university president's job is probably the second most difficult CEO position in the world. The first being that of a hospital administrator who's dealing with life and death.
Yeah.
Now, the one caveat with that is many universities, especially flagships, have a medical school associated with them. So the university president in that case is just as difficult, if not more difficult. I mean, the number of stakeholder groups you answer to, not really understanding what the fiduciary duties are, and having to deal with political boards. I mean, sometimes for some institutions, it can be a real nightmare.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's a tough job. It's a tough job.
It is. So getting back to the governance aspect, we've touched on the conflict of interest and how critical and undue influence, independent entities, things along those lines. But there really isn't any accountability. We talked a little bit about that. There isn't. Accreditors have some, but I'm concerned that a lot of creditors don't really have the expertise on staff to understand accountability from a fiduciary perspective. And really, is it their job? I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, nor do I. I think that you'd like to think that there'd be enough controls within the university itself that the number one objective would be achieve alignment. If we could achieve alignment in what the desires and interests of the stakeholders were, it would be so much better for the university. And that getting the trustees to be aligned with the CEO, with the leadership of the university is critically important. But unfortunately, there's very little emphasis on that within higher education about preparing or educating a person about how to become a trustee. They just come in and they're appointed by a governor or however the system works, and it varies tremendously across the U.S. And they are expected to hit the ground running and just right off. And the challenge is some of them come in with agendas, and the agendas are not necessarily those that are consistent with those of the CEO or with other members of the board. So if you get a maverick in there, it can just create all kinds of havoc for everyone. And I feel sorry for the CEO who walks into a situation like that, and she or he is just totally blindsided by the things that go on within the board. Mm-hmm. It's the board dynamics that I think have to be really looked at carefully, and which means that when the appointments are made, it's important to know what the value system, in a sense, is for those individuals. And I'm talking about the institutional value of those. Why are they there? Why would they want to do it? What are they going to try to accomplish while serving in that position? Mm-hmm. For me, it needs to come down to what's in the best interest of the students that you're serving. But that's not always the case.
Yeah. Well, part of the challenge with knowing what the best interests of the students are is, and you see this very frequently in private institutions, you'll see the parentheses with the year that they graduated from that institution. Most of the trustees, it's rare to have younger trustees on boards, whether public or private. And they go back to, well, this is the way the university worked when I was there.
Yeah.
And the culture is 108. I mean, most of the folks are boomers, maybe Gen X that are on boards, and you're having to deal with faculty who are millennials. You've got some Gen X and something, but you're getting more and more faculty who are Gen Z. Students are definitely Gen Z. Value system is very, very different, and they try and impose that value system on the institution. And see, it doesn't work. It's oil and water.
Well, the challenge, I think, is stepping back and just trying to have a diverse set of trustees. And by diversity, I'm talking about geographic, age, all kinds of things. That diversity, to me, the power of diversity is getting people with different experiences coming together to achieve the alignment of their interests and that of the university. Unfortunately, when you look across higher education boards, there's too much sameness to it. It's too much. It's the good old boys network. And I particularly liked what Mike Duke, who was then the CEO of Walmart, was sharing with my leadership class that about why he wanted to increase the number of executives and all within Walmart who were minorities and who were women. He said, this is not just about social equity or anything else like that. It's good business. Said, look at who our customers are. Look at who's making the buying decisions within our stores. We need to have people involved who are more aligned and understand what our customers are looking for within our stores.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his senior people came and said, well, you're talking about people like me not having opportunities. He said, no. He said, this is not a zero-sum game. He said, I'm not talking about a fixed size of a pie. I'm talking about making the pie bigger for everyone. As we do this, as we get bigger, there are going to be increased opportunities for people who look like you and look like me, but also we're going to be growing that we're giving opportunities for others who are not at the table now.
Mm-hmm. I worked with a client. Board had 24 people on it, which we're going to get to board size here in a little bit. Anyway. This board had all white men. One of them was Hispanic, Christian college, so they were all of the same faith.
Yeah.
They lamented because their student demographic was pretty much all white. There were very few. It's like, folks, have you looked at a mirror lately? If you want to have diversity, whether it be gender, whether it be race, thinking, whatever, you have to embrace diversity yourself.
Yeah. Well, we certainly have seen that. So within my university there at the University of Arkansas, when our department head was a woman, suddenly we increased the number of women students wanting to pursue engineering. And oh, by the way, they also wound up holding the leadership positions in all the student organizations. They were industry coming and hiring and said, your top students are now women students. That's what happens. You lead by example. And when someone can look and see someone that looks like them, then they say, hey, I've got a chance here. I'll never forget, I came in to be the chancellor at the university, and the first week, all the media folks within the university wanted to meet with me so they could write these articles about the new chancellor. And the first question I was asked is, tell me, Dr. White, what do you miss most about Georgia Tech? And I said, it's not Georgia Tech that I miss. I said, it's Atlanta. And what I miss is the diversity. I said, this place is too white for me. And their eyes got really big. I said, within this building, how many African Americans we have in this building? And I gave them the number. I said, how many Hispanic Latinos we've got? I gave them the number. I said, how many? I went through, I said, if we're going to be the University of Arkansas, we need to look more and more like Arkansas. And we need to, Drumm, then the next thing I'm giving a talk at the Rotary Club up in Rogers, and I said the same thing there. And people's eyes got just as big as they did with my staff. But the truth was we needed to be looking more like those we were serving. And that has made a difference. Now, the university's not there yet, but it's made big strides. But to just ignore the situation.
Yeah.
And now with the recent Supreme Court about race-based admissions and things like that in universities, with that coming down, I just hope that we'll be able to find a way to still have a diverse set. When I came back from the National Science Foundation at Georgia Tech, I was teaching a class and my son was in the class. So I wanted him to hear his dad say this. And all these kids now, they're at Georgia Tech. I looked out and I said, if you think that the color of your skin or your gender or your national origin in some way correlates to what your intelligence and ability are as engineers. You're sadly mistaken. And what we need to do here is to provide an environment where you can learn to work with and folks who don't working with folks who don't look like you, who don't think like you do, who don't believe what you do, who don't learn like you do. Because when you graduate from here, you're going to go out into the world and you're going to work with and for folks who aren't like you. Mm-hmm. So I've got to help you get over this mistaken belief that there's something about you that gives you an edge over those who aren't just like you. So I feel like that within the university, it's our responsibility to bring the world into the university so that young people can get an exposure to that, so that when they go out, they are prepared to be effective within that world.
Exactly. There's been great studies by AAC&U about what employers want. They want people who can think critically. They want people who can work in teams. And if we don't give them that basis, because the world is not homogeneous, okay? It's there's all sorts of, colors, origins, etc. We all think differently regardless of, whether white, black, orange, purple, it doesn't really matter. We have to learn how to work with people. And the basis, how people can learn that, is at university. Let's swap horses. I mentioned board size, and I know you and I have had some wonderful conversations on this. More versus less directors. What do you think?
Well, and it obviously, with most questions, I guess this is my engineering background, the answer is it depends. It depends.
You sound like a consultant.
Indeed. And well, I had a consulting firm too, so I learned that really quickly. The definition of a really good consultant is someone who can borrow your watch, tell you what time it is, charge you for it, and keep the watch. But at any rate, let's get back to board size.
Jack Welch.
Yeah, indeed. What I think within corporations, I believe the most effective boards I was on were those that were relatively small, because you could achieve alignment. You didn't have all of these people on the board with conflicts of interest and things like that. You really get focused in, and what you were doing is you were trying to support the CEO and the strategy and all for the corporation. Now you turn to higher education. There are just too many
cooks in the kitchen.
Oh, you're not kidding, and really it is. And there's no question about it. And the job is hard. If you're a university that has 10 to 20 trustees in it, it's just a huge challenge for that CEO. And so what do? Well, you'll do like Gordon Gee did, Ohio State. You'll then create another entity between this large board and you to try to come to some ability to work with a small number of people. I don't think you can be effective dealing with a large board. I'm sorry, but those that do, I think if you look at it, you would find out that, in fact, the trustees are actually exerting very little influence on what's happening within the organization. I think it's really that the CEO is running things and the others are there more just sort of checking off the boxes and agreeing. Mm-hmm. But if you really want to have a well-functioning board, and Drucker made the same kind of points, but he did that years and years and years ago. But still, we're trying to learn those lessons. And unfortunately, what happens with public ones, and in fact, you're working with one of those now, they'll have designated entities from which the trustees will come. Well, what happens then? That trustee then feels like he's got to represent the group that this trustee was selected to represent, as opposed to representing the entire university. And so if you're not careful, you're going to have people coming in without alignment on a one university and a one approach, and this is what we're trying to do. Each one's going to have their own separate agendas they're trying to advance within it. So I'm all for small boards. Now, how small is small? Well, in my judgment, 10 is an upper bound and 4 is a lower bound, and it should be between 4 and 10 generally, mm-hmm. I would think. But then you get into the nonprofit organizations and all. Well, you've got to have all the different stakeholders represented. Well, that adds the complexity to it. So generally, I'm for small boards.
Yeah.
That's a long-winded answer to your question. Small, that's my answer, and I'm sticking
Small,
to
there
it.
we go. And we're going to differ a little bit on this. I think you've got some boards who are just out of control. I mean, I know one board that's in the process of cutting down from 60 members down
How many?
to 60, 60.
Oh, my stars.
Yes. And they have an executive committee who essentially functions as their board at this point. So, and that's perfectly fine to have. My optimum is somewhere between 10 and 20 because there's so much oversight, especially at a flagship university or a system that needs to happen. But you've also got to have good, and you touched on this, your fiduciary responsibilities have to be to the university instead of the legislature or the governor or whoever appointed to you. Part of it is it's that independence from outside influence. People look at being on these boards as not necessarily a check mark, but as a badge of pride for them. And they're going to do a lot of things that they might not do otherwise, just to be sure that they can keep that appointment. I mean, I know boards that have got members on it that have been on the board 40 years. And
my stars.
Oh yes, that's, So anyway, we talked about NIFO, nose in, fingers out.
Yeah.
The board duties, and I knew this was going to happen, John. We're running out of time here.
Oh no.
But the traditional board duties, I mean, the duties of the board, it's always been hire, fire, hold the president accountable for the institution, policy setting, doing strategic goals and objectives, although some of them come in and say, okay, we're going to do the strategic plan too. It's like, no. Ensuring there's revenue generation and sustainability. But we're starting to see some new duties creeping in from corporate America. Succession planning.
Yeah.
How many higher ed boards have done succession planning? Not many. Communications. You and I talked about this before, the hourglass model where everything has to funnel through the president versus wagon wheels. One of the models I like to use is the wagon wheel, where you've got the board in the middle, you've got your stakeholder groups there, and your committees have actually people from stakeholder groups as non-voting members, but they're there attending the committees. And then risk oversight. I mean, this is a huge one. If any institution doesn't have risk oversight built into their board duties, let me remind you of a really 5-letter word that really impacted everybody: COVID.
Oh yes. Well, but also the risks. There's the one that I think trustees don't give enough thought to is reputational risk.
Exactly.
It's not just about legal and financial and all the business now with IT and what the risks are there. Reputational risk. Look at what's happened to the reputations of universities because of things that happen. The ones getting all the headlines are in athletics, but it's not just in athletics that creates the reputational risk. But it's very difficult for a CEO to have knowledge and understanding what's going on throughout the organization. And all it takes is one part of that organization with someone that just is not aligned, again, there's that word, with the best interests of the institution to create tremendous damage to that university. We've seen so many examples in the last decade.
Yeah. Larry Nassar.
Oh, well, indeed.
Jerry Sandusky.
Yes. And the list goes on.
It does. So what do we do? What's the answer for improving governance? Or is there just one? I don't think there's any silver bullet.
Well, I do. Well, I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I do wish that we had something equivalent to the SEC to hold people accountable that are on these boards. To whom do they answer? we had in place processes to judge the effectiveness of individual trustees within corporations.
Mm-hmm.
I've not seen that occurring within higher education.
Very little.
Yeah. Of annually asking, the 360 assessment, asking every trustee to assess and evaluate the effectiveness of every other trustee, to get management to also participate in evaluating the effectiveness of the trustees. Mm-hmm. All of this doesn't just flow from the top down. It needs to also be going up, that the trustees need to be held accountable and understand they're there to do work. Too many of them view it as a perk that, oh, good, I get to go to the bowl games. I get to go to the NCAA tournament games. I get to come to all of the black tie events and fitted and all of this. But no, there's some real work that needs to be done, and it's important work, and you need to take it seriously. And that means you've got to have the time to give to it. You also need to have the qualifications for it. But no one seems to even look at what those are. How much time is demanded? How much time do you have available? What areas of expertise are we looking for right now in terms of appointing trustees? None of that seems to occur within the higher education, but it does occur within corporations. Mm-hmm. It has to.
Yeah. When we come in and we work with a university and help them improve their governance, obviously there's, looking at their bylaws, et cetera, but we do a full-blown assessment. We've got a 75 question assessment that we have trustees and other people take. We use a skills matrix to find out, do you have the skills on the board to be able to provide good oversight? Because the roles of the boards are changing. It's not only oversight mm-hmm. now, it should be consulting, be there mm-hmm. as someone to have discussion. And without having the right skills on the board, you can't do that.
Exactly right.
So, John, I knew this was going to happen. We're so far out of time here.
So, wow.
Typical. Okay, last two questions. 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards. What are the most critical things that they need to be doing?
Well, number one that overarches it is the alignment issue. To work to align internally within the organization and aligning with the trustees and to align for what we're trying to do here and get an understanding and buy-in on that everyone is working to accomplish a very well-defined goal or objective. But the other is to understand and take advantage of the power of diversity to make sure that you have good fit within the organization. When I've asked in corporations, why do you have turnover at the executive level? Invariably, it's because of fit, issues of fit. And then the other, it gets back to this issue we've discussed, which is size. That size matters in terms of your ability to communicate and work effectively with the governance board. Alignment to me is the thing that is missing so often when you look at where difficulties occur within a higher education institution. So those are the three that I would hit right now.
Great. Thank you. So what's next for you?
Oh, my. Well, as you know, I just recently published Why It Matters, Reflections on Practical Leadership. And so I'm involved in doing a number of things with that. And basically, my goal is to try, because I come out of engineering, I believe that we should find a way that all engineering students have an opportunity to take a well-structured course on leadership that starts out in the university and get them to where they really understand the challenges, the rewards, and all about leadership. But so an emphasis on leadership, that's now sort of my thing that I'm really honing in on. And then the other, it'll be a shock to you. I'm surprised because you have no idea about this, but I have another book I'm determined to publish, and it's a layperson's commentary on the Gospel of John. That was what I did as Chancellor of my escape, when I would literally go into a closet where my computer was, and I would work on this. And so I taught a Sunday school class and did that. But I've got a complete draft ready, but I need to hone it down, not unlike what happened with Why It Matters. It's way too big. I've got to go in and be judicious in what's included. So I want to do that. But the other is I'm mentoring a number of people around the country who are holding dean's positions or president positions. And I've told them, I said, look, I know how lonely your job is because you get to some issues you can't discuss with anyone, not your partner, not your spouse, because that person does not have attorney-client privilege and can be deposed in litigation. And I've gone to court many times. And so it's a lonely spot. And I've told these individuals what's said to me stays with me, that if you ever get to a point you just need someone to talk to, know that I'm there because I care.
That's really good. That is really good and so well needed out there. John, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to chat.
Likewise, Drumm, all the best to you, and hit them long, hit them straight, and make every putt.
Thank you. That's great advice. Thanks. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to John White for joining us and for his sharing his views on higher education governance. Always a pleasure, John. I look forward to the next time we have you on the show. Our next guest is Chris Kubierski, president of Highland Community College. Highlands is a very unique place, and much of it is due to Chris's leadership style, which builds a culture of inclusion and consensus, traits that lead to a culture that embraces change. It promises to be a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to sharing it with you in the near future. Until next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.